Dawn rose on the smoking sea like a slow breath through a veil. The light came thin and cautious, as if the day itself remembered the old ruin and did not wish to offend it. Ash lay on the water where other seas keep foam, drifts of gray dust that bunched and parted under the passing of the fleet. The ships moved carefully, their crews speaking low as if voices might bruise the air, as if sound carried weight here and the deep would feel it. Daenerys stood at the prow of her flagship with one hand on the rail and the other at her side, fingers opening and closing without her bidding. The wood was warm from the sulfur breeze. The varnish wore a glaze of grit. Beneath, the hull complained in small ways. Above, the wind touched her hair and brought the sting of minerals to her tongue. The sea wore a taste like the first lick of a coin. Old copper, human breath, the bite of iron. She had never thought ash could shine. Yet when the pale sun looked low and sideways through the cloud, each floating film showed faint colors like oil on a roadway. Ghost blues, bruised purples, the thin green of a pear's skin. It slid past, 1,000 delicate sheens undone by the wake. Drogon came down from a high wheeling arc with a shadow like a passing storm. He turned at the last and skimmed so low that the wake lifted for him. His scales flashed black where they caught the light and black where they didn't. He was blackness layered so thick it had begun to glimmer. His passing stirred the ash and left a clean gash on the sea, a slice to water beneath. Regal and Viserion took the breadth of the sky more gently, their wing beats slower, their bodies like slow rivers. Their breath misted at the mouth edges and flared, and where it drifted down the sea hissed as if something below were irritated at the intrusion of fire. "Shall I have them sing?" asked the Summer Islander at her side, keeping his voice just above a whisper. He had introduced himself as Ullo Saren, captain of the Nkosi, though all his men called him Kosi like the ship. His hair was gathered high and wrapped with beads the color of teak, and he smelled of clove and clean oil. He watched the sky as a man watches a woman he loves when he thinks no one sees. "Not yet," Daenerys said, eyes still on the water. Her throat worked once. "Let them ride the morning. They'll want the air after so many nights ashore." He accepted that with a small bow. "We'll be in the lee of the Oryx's mouth by noon with this wind. The pilots know where the spits lie. You see the low spume there? That's pressure from a breathing vent. Give it a wide margin." He could have said, "This sea has a pulse." He could have said, "The ruin is alive in its own manner." The smoking sea did not sleep. It wheezed and steamed and muttered through its vents. Sometimes it flashed under the surface. Pale fires caught and smothered before they could find air. Sometimes the ash rose in slow swells like the bellies of whales. The old maps showed little islands with quaint names. Those had gone down generations ago, or drifted to new places, or risen into shapes no one recognized. The pilots were men and women with charcoal faces who had taste for risk and eyes accustomed to shimmering. They had sailed these waters for years in secret for the pirates and smugglers who moved between ruin and coast like swallows in autumn. Now they wore blue scarves to show her protection and hard faces to show they did not entirely trust it. She had promised herself months ago that she would not harden. Queens in old tales stiffened into names. They turned to coins and were poor. If Valyria could be reborn, the new city must not have a queen of ash with a crown of ember and a heart of sealed iron. It must have a woman who still remembered warmth. The deck under her feet pitched lightly. The ash moved like breath. The day came cautious and she made her own breath slow to match it. "Your Grace." The voice behind her was formal but soft. Missandei had learned to speak the languages of men with the smooth care of someone threading a needle in a swaying room. When Daenerys turned, the scribe held a folded piece of vellum and a reed-cut pen. The envoys send word. They wish to know the hour you will keep counsel on the landing ground. "Tell them we wait for the pilots to fix our anchorage," Daenerys said, "and for the ash to settle. Tell them to look at the air. It moves. A council in shifting dust is a council of ghosts." Missandei's mouth curved, the suggestion of a smile. "As you say." Grey Worm stood further aft with 4 of his captains, all with ash on their shoulders like frost. He watched the ships of the free cities in their varying shapes and signatures. The Volantines brought low, wide-bellied ships with hungering mouths carved at the bows. The Bravosi had long, sleek gullers with eyes painted for seeing. Mir and Tyrosh brought colors on their pennants so clean and jeweled they looked almost obscene against the pale sky. Lys sent only one vessel, white and delicate as a shell, and stayed aloof as if refusing to let any smoke touch it. There were 3 ships from Karth, where old men drank hot milk with quartz in it and remembered the days of colored towers and paraded skeletons. The Karthine had wrapped their sails in muslin when the ash grew thick. Their crews moved in gloves. They carried little bells on their rigging to frighten away the spirits of the deep. The bells made a small, perpetual sadness. Daenerys watched the fleet and the dragons and the ash until the light sharpened and the horizon drew a line instead of a blur. The pilots signaled in blue. She tapped the rail twice with her knuckles, a habit older than she could name. Then she turned from the prow and went down the narrow steps with Missandei at her shoulder. The passage to the cabin smelled of pine and damp. Ullo Saren's ship was clean as a thought, the ropes coiled like disciplined snakes, the sailors moving with a quiet that came as much from respect as from habit. He had hung glazed plaques along the passage, paintings from his home. A beach with a path of shells laid for a marriage, a grove where men in white carried carved masks, a game board graven with elephants. Daenerys took them in without breaking stride. Years had placed pictures in her life like stepping stones. Molten cities and warm tents and a boy in the dust and men who wore their honor like a blade and men who mistook her for a stone statue they could move. She had crossed each picture and become another one, a woman along a gallery to herself. The cabin was bright. Ullo Saren had insisted on broad windows and a door that took a crossbreeze. Near the long table that served them for council hung a map shroud. Silk and card and parchment layered to make a quilt of the world. The pieces of 9 cities lay over one another like scales. Daenerys had learned to keep maps like this so she could lift and peer and understand the ways in which places overlapped without touching. In the middle of it, off-center and tilting toward the lower right, the smoking sea hunched like a burned cake in a bowl. "When we land," she said, and Missandei lifted the reed to hear the shapes of the words. "We do it with order. We set the first ground on the spine of rock. We plant the standards where the gas vents do not breathe. We make paths first, not walls." Missandei wrote as quick as water, but the scratch of the pen felt solid in the cabin. "Yes. Grey Worm will command the camp of breath. He will place the compartments as we planned. The healers set up their place downwind with the black tents and the oil lamps. No more than 100 to a tent. No bedding until the ash has warmed and cooled and warmed again. The glass blowers need their sand. The smelters will ask for or they cannot yet have. We give them the ashes and the bones. We give them the old glass if we find it, and the tephra. Drogon will light the first kiln." Missandei's eyes flicked up once. "And the envoy?" "The envoys will stand their hour beneath the dragons and remember that an oath begun in fear is still an oath. Tell them we meet after the first kiln is lit. They want to call me queen. They will call me mother if it pleases them and dragon if it pleases them, but I will not be queen of those who still dream of chains. Any man who arrives in the smoking sea with a chain in his dream must bury it or leave. I will make it plain." Missandei's voice had no edges. She had learned long ago the ways that blunt truths can be wrapped in silk without weakening them. Daenerys moved to the window. The dragons rose on the shallow gust that the sea made when it exhaled. Regaled of then, sudden as a boy's laughter, and snatched a fish that had fled too near the surface. He ate as he climbed. It pleased her to see them take their feed without being fed. The simplest things were kindest. She did not remember being a girl fed at a table anyone called home. "Who will come to the council?" she asked. Missandei recited from memory. "Volantis sends Triarch Malakwo Mailer, younger. He calls the slave banners disbanded. He brings a small cohort of the Tiger Party who will change stripes as needed. Bravos sends Adrian of the Third Vault, with keyholder Thala and a man whose wrists are heavy with rings. Mir sends a master of lenses called Emerin who has never left her city before. Tyrosh sends Archon Rhys Oler as if to say his presence itself is largest. Lys sends the Lady Chara with lace at her cuffs and 2 perfumers who will complain of the air. Karth sends 3, all old, all convinced that your youth is an insult to process. Pentos sends a magister who calls himself a poet and will try to speak in couplets until he is embarrassed into sense. Norvos sends no one. The Lorati have sent a boat and will pretend they do not know why. And the Iron Bank? Here, Missandei said simply. He speaks little and counts often. Daenerys nodded once. They all bring blood, she said. Whether they know it. She felt Missandei pause, a held breath in the pen's scratch. Perhaps the word had weight today. Perhaps all words had more weight here. As you say, they left the cabin when the calls began. The pilots guided the ships into an embrace of rock. They did not need to drop anchors. The place had stone spines that grew upward like ribs from a chest. Men leapt with ropes and made the moorings fast. The ash blew down once, a sudden curtain, and then drew aside in a draft so clean that the air tasted briefly like rain. The landing ground lay up a steep shelf. It was not truly a beach. It was a flattened tongue of stone and old fused glass, ridged like the palate of an enormous beast. It took foot and boot and sandal and left prints like shadows. In places the glass was darkly translucent. Within it something like bubbles had been frozen and turned to starry voids. Grey Worm was first down the plank. His face was what it had learned to be, unreadable, careful. His eyes were not careful at all. He took the ground with quiet feet and turned twice to taste the air with his whole body. He lifted a hand to signal and men began to descend. They came in columns, then opened and set their things down with attention. A soldier learns to give attention to things that do not look like enemies. Rope, whetstone, lung. He marked a perimeter with his captains and 2 of them tested the ground with long poles. The poles sank easily in one place and not at all in another. He circled that place with small stones and marked it on a scratched slate. Grey Worm touched his throat, lowered his head, and breathed to the count of 4 and to the 4 again. He had learned a long time ago to teach his lungs to be frugal. The healers set their black tents with the quick competence of people who remember that hesitation costs. They kept their water under cloth and their vinegar in stoppered skins and their oil in closed jars. They handled the lamps with fingers that had learned to be kind to flame. A Myrish woman with a braid so sharp it looked like another tool went about pinning cloth over buckets and troughs, taking the ash before it could steal into everything. Her name was Emerin, and she carried a pouch of lenses at her belt as if they were coins. She took out one to look at the ground close. What she saw made her eyes widen, but she said nothing yet. She slid the lens back into its pouch and pressed the mouth of the pouch closed with care, as if an idea might escape. Daenerys stepped down into the shallow crater the foot traffic had made. The ash lapped about her sandals like a pet. The light was fuller now. The sun had lifted and thinned the fogs, and the brow of the ruin showed itself in faint outline. Humps and hollows of slag and black hills whose flanks sheened like seals. Something darker than ash smoldered in a distant seam and breathed out ribbons of smoke that lay flat and did not go anywhere. A gull made of soot came and stood a while on 3 toes and then flapped off when Drogon drifted close to show his interest. The first kiln was raised like a shepherd's dome. It took 24 men and women to set the stones and fusion glass in their curve. They worked gloved and masked, their voices piled inside the cloth and warm with their own breath. Drogon came close and turned his head and looked at it with an interest that held amusement in it. She knew that look. It was how he watched her when she did something small and dear. He shuffled nearer and placed one clawed forefoot lightly on the ground, curved his head, and breathed. The sound was brief and deep as a cough. Fire like a thrown tapestry hit the kiln and wrapped it. The stones glowed in the first second and then quivered toward white. The glass went soft. The kiln's mouth gulped air and held a shape that was hunger. Drums began to beat a little way off, just a slow 2 and 2, to steady the arms of those who carried. Men moved with long cradles loaded with shards gathered along the slag slopes. Old window, old goblet, old bottle that had held a perfume no nose here would know. The shards slid into the mouth of the kiln like birds into a throat. Drogon drew back and the fire died because he decided that it was enough. Missandei stood at Daenerys' shoulder, and the ash had found her eyelashes and made them pale at the tips. She looked younger. It made Daenerys' heart do a small private thing. She put her hand on Missandei's sleeve briefly, enough for both of them to feel the other. Then she lifted her chin and said, "Bring the envoys." They came like caravans bring color to dust. Triarch Malakwo had a robe of red that looked heavy enough to be its own problem. He was broad and not tall, with eyes that darted and lips that did not. The Braavosi banker wore gray meant to vanish. He put his feet carefully on the fused glass as if already thinking of the cost of broken ankles. The keyholder Thala kept her own counsel and took in everything with a calm that made the men at her side try to seem as if they had planned it. The Myrish lenswoman Emerin had taken off her gloves and held one in her teeth as she pointed to something small half-buried in the ash. The Tyroshi Archon arrived with jewels that shone through the dust as if refusing to be dirted by it. The Lyseni Lady Chara wore a veil that drifted with every breath. The Carthene elders came under white parasols that tasted of camphor. The Pentoshi poet tried a couplet in greeting, heard it break against the air, and bowed himself into prose. Others she did not know stood behind them, taking the measure of this place and of her as if she were part of the ground. "Welcome," Daenerys said. Her voice went plainly over the ash and touched every ear without having to be loud. "You came for the seeing. Look, then we will speak." They did look. Some of them had the grace to turn their faces entirely to the place as if the ruin were a person being addressed. Others watched her while pretending to watch the ash. Dragons do not bow and they do not curtsy, and there is a way that men look at those who do not bend. Drogon came down then and stood behind her and watched the envoys with an expression that improved many men's posture. Regal and Viserion took the high beams of the air and crossed in a slow figure that had no name. Triarch Malakwo broke first. He was a man with his hands chained to his own cuffs by habit, each finger bound to his ring, but even he could not make silence last long. "Stormborn," he began, but she tilted her head and he swallowed the title. "We see that you do as you said. The kiln is a comfort. The sight of fire contained is a comfort. Where will you build?" "Here," she said, "and there, and along that rise, and across to that bank if it does not sigh too often. Where the eel vents sleep we will put ground that breathes. Where the ash stays quiet we will put the first courts." He looked at the kiln again. It did not look like comfort. It looked like intention. "And what will it be called?" She turned her face to the ash. She had dreamed names for months and then left them where she found them. It seemed like a thing one must not bring with her but only find underfoot. "We will let it be named by what it is," she said after a slow breath. "If it is a port, it will be called the port. If it is a forge, it will be called the forge. If it is only a beginning, it will be called beginning. The old city had too many names. We will have one and leave it at that. When we know it, we will say it, and it will not need to be repeated to be believed." The banker from Braavos inclined his head, a movement so subtle it might have been wind. "It is expensive to change a name once it is written in cold iron," he said. "I will not make you melt letters," she said. Lady Chara half lifted her veil. "If perfume is to be made, I will need flowers or regrets. There's regret Inu." "Jaich," Daenerys said. "Flowers will have to wait." The Carthene elders shuffled, blinked, looked at the dragons when they thought they could do it without being seen, looked away when they discovered they could not. "We have sent our men to fetch the water sand," said the Archon of Tyrosh, Rhys Oler. "We will make glass that will sing when it cools. Tyrosh glass does that. It carries the breath of the singer within it until the breath goes home again." Emerin of Myr swallowed the glove and smiled a little and spoke to the glass itself, perhaps so that the Archon would hear her without being answered. "There is old glass a hand's depth down," she murmured. "More where it has pooled like black honey and caught the shapes of the last things that fell through it. There are faces under our feet, and teeth." She crouched and brought out her lens and looked again at the bubble voids. "And seeds. The old city was not burned so much as fused," said Keyholder Thala. She had been silent so long that some in her party had begun to forget she knew how to speak. The people, the houses, the stories. In the blow are mingled everything. She looked up at Daenerys then. You mean to throw your breath into this? You mean to blow a new bottle from the same melt? Daenerys stood without moving, as if stillness could seem like patience rather than the effort it was. I mean to make something that cannot be put back in a mold, she said. The old city was a room with 1,000 chairs chained to the floor. Too many died to keep the floor polished. If we need chairs here, we will make them so they can be moved. The Triarch's mouth twitched. You mean to abolish what has made our cities rich? I mean to abolish what has made your cities hollow. He watched her then, as men do who are measuring the depth of a well with a stone and a string and are not certain whether the stone they have chosen will tell them anything. He did not drop it. In Bravos we have no chains, said the banker mildly. You have debts, she returned, just as mild. He smiled and did not deny it. They stood that way with the kiln breathing and the ash lifting and falling like a slow tide. The chill of the place did not come from cold. It came from the lack of animal. No bird sang, no cicada scratched. Even the waves hushed themselves. The noise came from rocks talking slowly in their heat, from distant cracks, from the pause between breaths when the vents waited for air. The dragon's lungs made their own weather. Daenerys raised her hand. Grey Worm moved then, and the captains with him. They carried a small table made of shipwood and set it under a standing slab of black glass that had set itself upright sometime in the old catastrophe. It made a clean and improbable wall 10 men high and thin enough to let the light through so that the ash behind it was a secret. On the table was a bowl of milk glass with sides as thin as a veil and a base like a seed. Missandei set a folded cloth beside it. In the bowl lay the powder of ground obsidian, a pile of old coins, Bravosi irons and Volantine coppers and Myrish silvers and Tyroshi mint with their mad dyes rubbed onto the metal, and 3 small stones she had found herself, each with a thread of something undescribed running through it in a line like a vein. We have no altar, Daenerys said. We have no god here large enough to stretch across the sea and call this place good or bad. We have fire. We have breath. We have the blood that runs in us, the blood of 9 cities. If this is to be built by that blood, let us put it into the first stone before we ask the stone to carry us. She looked to Missandei, who drew from a pouch a set of small knives, their edges bright and clean as answers. She laid them out one by one. She did it as she did most things, with attention, without decoration. Each of you came here knowing this would be asked, Daenerys said. Let there be no misunderstanding. If you wish to stand outside this oath, stand outside the walls when they rise. Be honest about your appetite. No man is forced to become an ancestor of a thing he does not wish to see live. She did not call on anyone. She waited. The waiting sifted them like flour, and the first who could not abide the sifting stepped forward. The keyholder Thala touched the blade to her finger and held her hand still. The drop that gathered at the fingertip looked too bright. A garnet squeezed briefly out of a ring. It fell into the bowl's powder and dimpled the surface. The banker watched the drop as if calculating its weight. Triarch Malakwo followed, setting his jaw against his body's small distaste. The Myrish lenswoman Emmerin cut herself without looking. Rhys Oler grinned as if he enjoyed sharp things. Lady Chara pressed her finger so delicately that it seemed she might decline to bleed, but blood must obey some laws, and it did. The Carthene elders each let one drop and wrinkled as if fearing some spirit would see their blood and learn their names. The Pentoshi Magister completed his couplet in his head, but said nothing as he extended his hand. Men and women from more ships came. One refused and stepped aside, stared at his own palm as if it held a small betrayal. Others in his party bled without him and did not look at him afterward, which was a new arrangement of their faces. When the bowl held enough to be called a mixture, Daenerys lifted it. Missandei steadied the base with her fingertips. The bowl was as cool as it looked. The powder had taken the wet as sand takes rain. With patience, she raised her face and Drogon moved like a thought. He came down and put his head over her shoulder and looked with one slitted, living eye into the bowl. He opened his mouth only slightly and let a breath of heat pass. The powder smoked and then seethed and then stilled. When she lowered the bowl, the glimmer in it was not ash or metal but something else. It looked like a stone that remembered being liquid. She put it back on the table and set the bowl at its center. She did not touch what she had made. In the morning, she said, though it was not yet noon, we will chip this and set the chips in the first cornerstones. If we pull down those stones one day, the new builders will find us there. The men from Bravos nodded, some with small involuntary hunger. The Valentine smiled as if he had tricked someone. Emerin leaned forward so far that Missandei put out a hand as if to catch her. The Tyroshi made his bracelets chime. Grey Worm marked the position of the table with scratches on his slate and set men to watch it through daylight and night. They did not call her queen. They said her name where it was needed and let the empty air after it hold whatever title it wanted. She dismissed them with no gesture at all, just turned and walked away and knew they would fold their caravans and move because they could not bear to stand where she was not standing. It was not power, it was gravity. She knew the difference. Power was something you could hold and others could pry from you. Gravity belonged to the world. Men could break their teeth on it. The day went on opening itself. The ash made a sound like a book page when men ran. The kiln belched and settled into its work. When the first pour came, it was a ribbon of molten glass so beautiful that the men carrying it forgot for a heartbeat to keep their feet. They set it and it cooled with a whisper that was almost a song. Emerin listened with her head tilted. It is slightly true, she said to no one. Not wholly, but some. Grey Worm took men along the ridges to map the ground with their poles, and their slow feet and their breath counted to 4. Missandei walked among the tents and checked the water. The healers had a boy cough into a cloth so they could look at the trace and decide what herbs to steep. Ullo Saren stood with sailors and made the kind of knots that take a sea in one hand and put it softly to bed. Through all of it, Daenerys moved like the ash light, present without haste, curious without fragility. She drank water and sucked a sour plum and felt the sugar as if soft teeth were biting her tongue. She put her hand to the flank of a dragon and took the heat into her palm and kept it there until her bones hummed. She watched men argue over the best way to lash a black tent to a breathing earth and did not arbitrate. She watched the Carthene elders argue with the Myrish lenswoman because she had called their lenses old and they called hers impolite, and in the end they all put their lenses side by side and began to measure the bubbles in the fused glass. In the early afternoon, a boy from Bravos named Lento, his name too large for him yet, as names often are for boys, ran toward the kiln with a stone cupped in both hands. He had ash in his hair and a grin like a window unshuttered. "My lady," he called, forgetting titles. "There is, something that shines from within." "Walk," Grey Worm said softly to him, and Lento obeyed, confused and obedient at once. He walked the last 20 paces with his grin quieter. He held out his find to Emerin because the woman's eyes had made him think of truth. It was a fragment of something that had been both glass and bone. Bone had been turned to glass and glass had remembered bone. Through it like a thread ran a line of dark metal fine as a hair. It threw back the light irregularly, a thing built by accident and intention both. Emerin weighed it in her palm. "It is a fused remnant," she said. "But not only. There was a current, aguair, an armature. It held once a shape that wanted to hold. This is not a gob of drip. It is a piece of design that had catastrophe happen to it and is still designing itself." "Will it cut?" asked Rhys Oler, ever practical, admiring all that could be turned to a blade. "It will cut if asked," Emerin said and smiled down at the boy. "But I will not ask it." Daenerys bent to see it in the woman's palm. The piece was no bigger than a peach pit. She saw in it the memory of someone's cleverness turned strange. "Put it in the bowl tomorrow," she said. "Let cleverness have a fragment too." Emerin held the fragment against her lip for a heartbeat, then gave it back to the boy. "Keep it for now," she said, and Lento's eyes filled as if he had been given a kingdom and not a shard. He ran off and almost tripped and recovered with a dance that made 3 men grin without meaning to. By late afternoon, the ash grew inquisitive again. It came in little whirls that wrote nothing anyone could read. The vents breathed deeper, the dragons went higher, and Daenerys felt the change as a touch along her arms. She looked to Ullo Saren. He nodded, reading the air with the same patience he used to read people. "It will want to throw a tantrum," he said. "We will tie everything 2 times. Put the perfumers in the lee of the black glass," Daenerys said, remembering Lady Chara's thin wrists. "Their lungs will not forgive them if we leave them where they are." Grey Worm set men to lash with their best knots and to pull the ropes twice and tug. The Carthene elders drew their parasols against their chests and looked very small inside their white. The Triarch scowled and then smiled when he discovered he had been scowling. The banker from Bravos noted in his book how many lashing ropes he could count from where he stood. Missandei tucked the papers and sealed them under oilcloth with clean efficiency. When the ash finally came, it came like a city remembers its dead. It did not roar, crowded. Air turned to something else and took with it the edges of things. Men wrapped their heads and lowered their eyes and moved with care. The dragons hung like ships in a storm. Regal coughed once in irritation, and that was all it took to make a small valley in the cloud. The kiln's breath was the only light, the white of work. Daenerys kept her feet and put one hand on the cool black slaw. And felt through stone the slow heart of the place beating. Pressure building, pressure eased. She remembered a night in a house with walls like cloth and a boy who had never known a house. She remembered a hot day in a city of bells and a stallion who had never been asked to carry more than himself. She remembered a child's hand in hers that had not belonged to a child for long. She thought of those things without pain. It was not forgiveness. It was simply the end of a rope that had frayed and been tied to something else. When the ash thinned, the world she returned to seemed more solid, as if everything had taken a breath and agreed to keep shape another day. The watch set around the bowl under the black glass had ash on their eyelashes and corners of their mouths. Grey Worm nodded to her once. Nothing had moved that ought not to have moved. The bowl lay where she had set it, and within it, the cooled melt held a surface like a pond a moment after a fish's mouth kisses it. Night came not with darkness, but with relief. The ash fell in a slow, spent drift. Men ate with their masks pulled down. They drank water that tasted a little of ink and did not complain. The healers went tent to tent, building small altars to vegetables and vinegar and oil. Emerin sat beside the kiln and told the Tyroshi Archon about the way that light bends when it meets different faces of glass, and Rhys Oler pretended to be bored and failed. The keyholder Thala wrote a list with a pencil whose point she sharpened with a small knife. She wrote the word oath and then pressed her thumb on the paper where the word lay and felt the grit of the pencil and knew it was not iron and that she was glad of that. Daenerys walked the boundary until the darkness had to make way for her. Grey Worm came with her for the first circuit and then left her alone because he understood what a person needs. The ground gave back a little warmth through her soles. When she paused, the ash settled onto her shoulders and her hair, making her brighter and older at once. Drogon made a bored sound in his throat in the distance and then sighed and settled in the coil he favored, a thing like a burned snake made comfortable. The other two took perches on black spires and made the spires look as if they had grown for this purpose. At the far edge of the breath ground, she found a standing arch that looked like a mouth without a face. The arch had been a door once. The thing it belonged to was gone, but this stubborn curve did not accept that it had been freed from its duty. Wind went through it and made a frame of sound. She stood in it and stepped through and back and through again, and it was different each time, though only by the thickness of an eyelash. The third time she stopped and looked into the dark beyond, and something in the dark looked back at her. Not with malice, with curiosity. It was not a living thing. It was the place itself, and it was saying, "I remember what it is to be a city. Do you?" She lifted her right hand, let the ash gather, shook it, watched the shape of falling it made. "Not what you were," she said softly. "What you might be." The moon made no difference and still suddenly mattered. It lifted itself on a chain only it could see and made the ridges a little whiter and the bronze coins in her pouch a little darker. Men behind her laughed once, then checked themselves, then let themselves laugh again when they heard their own fear go thin. Somewhere a bell from a Carthene parasol chimed because someone turned in sleep. She went back to the center with the black glass wall. Missandei sat on a folded blanket with a ledger open on her knee, head bowed, hair gathered like a nest for thoughts. She looked up when Daenerys came, and her eyes were warm and alive and near. "They sleep," she said, keeping her voice small so that sleep might go on believing itself safe. "Not all, but enough. And you, I sleep when you sleep," Missandei said, and Daenerys knew it was both habit and vow and love. "Then I must learn," Daenerys said, and they smiled, and then they did not speak at all for a while. When she lay down on her own pallet, the shipwood under her shoulder, the canvas under her palm, the ash everywhere turning all colors to a cousin of itself. She thought she would be kept awake by the place. She was not. Sleep took her like a hand that had been waiting and was happy to do the work. She sank without dreaming into a room with no windows at all. The night's second breath came small and untroubled. The vents slept with the humans. The dragons muttered in their sleep and turned and did not lift their heads. Owls did not come. This was not their home. Far off, a seam cracked with a sound like a note on a harp. The ash kept falling. Men rolled over and made their ropes creak. At the turn of the night toward its last third, a small thing happened near the bowl under the black glass. One of the watchmen shifted his weight from foot to foot and blew his nose into a cloth and turned to coil the cloth in his hand to be sure none of its wet touched the bowl. As he turned, a pale shifting under the surface of the cooled melt caught his tired eye. He leaned forward once, then rubbed his eyes with the knuckles of the hand that did not hold the cloth, then leaned again. The surface had trembled once as if something far below had flicked it with a nail. He waited another 10 breaths, the count that Grey Worm had taught them for steadiness. The surface did nothing more. The watchman let out his breath and smiled at himself for being a child. He coughed into the cloth, watched nothing, held something, and did not notice that at the bottom of the bowl, where the cooling had set in bands like tree rings, a line had formed as fine as a hair, a circle within the stone. It was not a crack. It was the memory of a mouth. Dawn found them with the patience of one who had seen cities rise and fall and no longer took either personally. The tea came slow as before, but a touch warmer. Men woke with the tightness in their throats that comes from sleeping in strange air and were not surprised by it, and coughed, and drank, and lived. The kiln glowed a less vengeful color. The dragons had gone to a high place where the ash did not reach and looked down with the clean impudence of those who have no use for tents. Daenerys woke unstartled and put her hand under her head a moment and let sleep leave cleanly rather than be dragged off by hurry. Missandei sat with her pen again and the ledger again, a kind of prayer. The healers had lit all their lamps, and the light looked like yolk in each. They brought hammers and chisels to the bowl then, so careful that it felt as if they were approaching a child in a crib. The Myrish lenswoman Emeryn took her place nearest the lip and leaned, so that her braid nearly touched the glass. She set a finger on a point she liked and looked to Daenerys once. Daenerys nodded, and she gently drove a chip from the edge with patient taps that felt like respect. The sound traveled through the stone, through the table, through the men and women listening as if it had always been inside them. The chip slid into her waiting palm with the promise of a prayer answered in the future. Others followed. Each chip had within it a suggestion of color that was not color but the memory of blood and coin and bone and glass. When they had enough, Grey Worm took the sacks in both hands and held them like something hot, and they moved in careful steps to the corners where the first stones lay waiting to be set. The Triarch came near the bowl and considered it as if he might ask whether anything of Volantis lay in it that he could remove with the careful use of a small spoon. The banker counted again. The keyholder Thala looked all around to see who had found themselves indispensable and smiled when she saw that no one had. Lady Chara breathed from a vial and looked less pained. "Your Grace," said Emeryn softly, when all was nearly done, "there is a thing." She held up one of the chips and laid her lens over it the way a mother lays a cloth on a warm loaf to keep the heat. She lifted the lens and looked and set it down and lifted it again and looked again, each time as if someone else might have crept in and changed the world just off stage while she wasn't looking. Within the glass there are filaments. It is as if, when it cooled, the different melts chose paths rather than simply stopping. They wound around one another in the most beautiful way. It is, She ran out of words like a singer who finds the note she held is longer than her breath. It is not only fused, it is woven. Woven things can be unwoven, the banker murmured. Old women know knots better than men who count rope. Emran returned without turning her head. Rhys Oler leaned in with a cat's grin. And woven things can be cut cleanly, he said, and stretched his fingers. Perhaps is there. Not now, Daenerys said, quiet and absolute. There will be a time for cutting. The first work is setting. They carried the chips to the corners and laid them in little beds of prepared ash. Drogon came because he felt the attention and exhaled once very gently, and the ash fused into a skin that looked as if frost had found its twin in fire. Men pressed hands to it and felt the warmth. The first stone was set with no more ceremony than a breath. The second followed, and the third. At the fourth corner, Daenerys put her hand into the ash before anyone could stop her and came away with her palm dusted as if she had thrust her hand into a jar of flour. She pressed her palm onto the stone itself. When she lifted it away, the ash had made a print of her hand that the wind could not remove. It would not hold for long, of course. The world took its own. But for now it was there, five-fingered and small as hands go, a human thing. She stood, and the men around her stood. Their faces were new again because work makes new faces. Hill by hill, breath by breath, the place had begun to gather itself into a city because men had decided to treat it as one. That was the secret of any city. It was less miracle than agreement. They broke their fast with more care than appetite, and then, because a people cannot live on ash and intention, the new cooks built an iron grill and roasted fish that had passed too close to vents and died with their mouths open. The fish tasted clean and unnatural both. After, men sucked their fingers and did not say the words that had come into their mouths. Home. They were wise enough to let the feeling sit without being named. In the later morning, when the light was not yet hard, men on the northern ridge raised a cry that was not fright but a cousin of it. Surprise, sharpened. Grey Worm was there before the second cry had finished. Daenerys came with him, and a curve of others, like a flock drawn to where the air is interesting. On the other side of the ridge, a valley opened, shallow and wide. Its bottom a field of black glass whose surface had cracked not in random, ugly ruins, but in a pattern that woke some old part of the eye. It lay in interlaced hexagons, as if a giant had tried to copy a bee's careful room and then forgotten how to stop. Between the hexagons, in the slight depressions, had gathered silt that was not ash and not soil but something between. In the silt something green and indecent was forcing itself up, thin shoots like threads, the first knife points of leaves that had decided to try. Lady Chara took 3 steps and then one more. She put her hand to her veil and then did not lift it. Flowers, she whispered softly and without hope yet. By next week, if they live. They are wild, said Emran, kneeling, her lens in her hand, too excited to remember calm. No one planted this. The glass forced a pattern and the wind carried a seed and it took. It makes an order because of the fracture. Do you see? It is a mistake that knows what to do with itself. Daenerys did see. She felt something like teeth ungrit inside her. She breathed, and that breath was of air that did not hurt to take. We will leave it, she said to Grey Worm, who was already marking paths. Make a way around. Let no foot cross it. It is the city's first garden. It deserves to be allowed to be itself. They stood there longer than they needed to, each seeing in the green their own private promise. Rhys Oler saw a poison he might apply to someone pleasantly. The banker saw a hedge that could be made to keep people out. The keyholder saw an oath that might become dearer than iron. Emran saw optics. Missandei saw a shade place with a bench where words would read themselves without effort. Grey Worm saw a spot where he would bring his captains when he needed to teach them how to be useful men and keep something alive. When they came back from the garden, the ash was thinner again, and the air had taken on the sound of hammers tapping not in anger but in rhythm, each strike the second cousin of the last. A chain of unsullied men carried stones not with pride, which is dangerous, but with belonging, which is safe. The old rope had been cut into new lengths. The tents, too, had learned their places and looked less uneasy. The ships at the moorings seemed to have accepted the fact that they would not be needed this hour and settled against their lines with the relief of muscles after labor. Near the black glass wall, The bowl had been left alone. Sun fell on its surface in a way that made it seem it generated its own light. A fly found its way to the lip and decided this was a river it could drink. Then changed its mind too late and stuck one foot and then the others and pulled itself free with work. Went away irritated with what it could not explain. Daenerys came to it without a parade. She stood and looked into it, and the surface seemed to remember her and softened. Not truly, but in a way that eyes tell the mind about. She felt how tired she was and did not mind. She felt how not alone she was and did not fear. She lifted her hand once to touch the surface as a child touches the skin of a drum just to know what it will say. She did not touch it. She let her hand fall. She said nothing because the quiet was doing the talking, for now. A sailor from Ullo Saren's crew ran up the slope with urgency that he kept politely small until he reached a distance where breath made words possible. "Captain," he called, then saw her, stopped, put his hand to his heart with quick sincerity. "My lady, ships." Ullo Saren came from the border of tents with a coil of line over one shoulder and a knife between his teeth, which he took out for the sake of discourse. "What ships?" "From the west," the sailor said, looking as if this direction offended him. "Not the sea we came by, the inner sea." He swung his arm in a way that might have made a map if an eye could see the lines. Low in the water and slow and disliking themselves, loud without making a sound. "Volantis," the Triarch asked too quickly. "Not your sigils," the sailor said. He looked at Rhys Oler, who spread his hands as if to show they were clean. "No Tirosh, no Lige, no Bravos." "Pirates," someone said, as if naming a thing claimed it. "Or those who do not yet know what to call themselves," Missandei murmured, writing already, giving the new thing a place on her page where the words would not make it larger than it was. Daenerys turned her head slowly and looked to the dragons in the high sky. They had noticed before men had. She felt the prickle up her arms that came when their attention sharpened. She saw in the tilt of Drogon's head that he had decided this morning would hold one more task before his nap. She lifted 2 fingers and then a third, the small signal he knew, the one that meant not wrath but watch. "We will meet those ships," she said. "We will keep the garden. We will set the 5th stone." It sounded ridiculous put in a row like that. Ships and a garden and a stone. But that was how days were built. You took what came and you held what you had decided to love, and you did the next small necessary thing. The city would be reborn not through a miracle, though she would accept one if the world wished to be generous, but through the patient putting of stone on stone, oath on oath, breath on breath. Dragons could set kills and frighten men and flame a vent into obedience, but they could not write laws. That was for those who bled. She moved. The ash made a sound like someone writing. Men fell into their places not because they were told, but because they had learned where to put their bodies so that others might be able to breathe. The watch went to the edge of the ridge. Ullo Saren ran a line between 2 uprights and ran his hand along it as if reassurance lay in the smooth of a rope. Grey Worm put his captains where a shout can reach and not have to do too much work. Missandei wrote a heading she would strike out later when she thought of something better. They held there as the ships came, and they breathed, and they did not rush, and it turned out to be good that they did. The ships were low indeed, and they carried a stink of old pitch and new fear. They wore no clear flag, only a rag of dark cloth at each mast that moved as if it disliked being made to. The men on their decks were lean and not freshly fed. They stood behind stones that had once been capstans and now served as shields because everything can be a shield when you are out of things meant to be. At the bow of the leading ship stood a girl with hair hacked blunt and eyes that had not bothered to ask permission for anything since they had learned what refusing looked like. Her hands were wrapped with cloths. She held the wrap in her teeth so she could lift a long glass to her eye, then dropped it and spat as if the ash offended her mouth. She looked at the dragons, and her look was not fear and not love but the attentive appraisal of someone who has seen 1,000 ways to die and is curious about a new one. "Not pirates," Ullo Saren said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "Not yet. Those are refugees without a word for it. They are not running from us. They are running toward a place where the ash does not burn their tongues when they sleep." Daenerys lifted her hand and let the flag fall. The sign was simple, welcome. The new city did not have a gate yet, and still she opened it. The girl's ship slowed reluctantly, like a body that has learned to distrust rest. The men on the deck did not lower their stones, but they did not raise them either. The girl lifted the long glass again and looked at Daenerys with it, and then looked without it, and then put it against her heart as if something had suddenly become heavy. She would come ashore later and say a name that was no longer useful, and someone would give her bread that she would eat without weeping until she did. And she would tell a story about a city that had swallowed itself and a mother who had told her to run towards smoke if it rose in only one place, because their people would gather whether to die or to live. The girl did not know which had happened here. She had only seen kelp ash and glass and dragons, and among those two things there had been men. And among those men there had been a woman whose hand was dust and whose voice was unornamented and whose eyes had the same expression the sea gets when it decides not to kill you today. The day would go on and do what days do, widen then narrow. The fifth stone would be set. The bowl under the black glass would sit and be patient. The memory of its mouth would draw its ring tighter an eyelash's worth. The garden would put up 2 more blades of something green and indecent, and Lady Chara would stare at them until someone took her elbow and led her away to breathe. The Triarch would count the ships and how many mouths they might add to work and to worry. The banker would bend his head to Missandei's page and ask in his quiet voice where she placed the line measuring interest on a debt paid in drops. Missandei would lift her eyes and let him see that his question was clever, and then write a word he could not price. Toward evening, when the kiln had eaten and breathed and eaten again, Emmerin would take one of the cooled ribbons and flex it slightly in both hands and listen to its song not with her ears but with the bones as a woman listens to the child she might carry someday. She would look to Daenerys then and say, "They sing in a note just lower than memory." And Daenerys would not know what that meant and would know exactly, and she would think that if the city could sing it would be in a voice that sat in the chest and made room for more air, not a voice that pierced the head. At night again, when the ash had learned their names and decided to hang gently on their eyelashes, Daenerys would walk alone down the path that had become so in a day. She would find the arch and stand in it and step through and back and through, and each time the air would say the smallest word a world can say and still be a word. Yes. She would place her palm on the black glass close to where the bowl slept and feel the quiet heat there and hear very, very far down a sound like a city asking itself a question. And somewhere under the glass where the melted blood had found its cooled ring, a thin seam would sense a thumbprint of warmth above and move the smallest measurement a substance can move and remain still. It would remember too and be content with that. For now there were stones and breath and the simplest drinking and the promise of cooked fish. There were men who had learned to move without making the ash angry. There were dragons whose sleep had become their consent. There was a woman who retained the heat of a dragon in her palm and did not crowd anyone else from the fire. She stood at the shore as the last light thinned until it could not bear its own smallness and escaped into the water. The ash on the sea gathered itself into a single long sigh, and it occurred to her that the ruin might be grateful. She let the idea stay without swallowing or spitting. She held it on her tongue as the wind brought her the coin taste and the faint sweetness of something green. She watched the shapes of ships and men and tents become their night shapes. She listened for fear and heard only fatigue. She gave the sky back to the dragons and the ground back to those who slept on it and kept for herself only the part that kept the promise. Behind her in the bowl, the ring finished what it had started and became, all at once and to no one's notice, a perfect circle so fine it could escape the eye. In the morning someone would see it when the light laid itself down at just the right angle and ask what it meant, and 3 people would answer at once, and all their answers would be honest and wrong and helpful. That would be tomorrow's work. For now, the kiln breathed, and she breathed with it, and the city to be lay with its head on her shoulder and learned the rhythm of her chest.